Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, as I said before, credibility is important in this case. On the issue of credibility, you will include those witnesses you believe and those witnesses you do not believe. Now, the government has presented this man, Phoenix. Frankly, I cannot believe that he would come in here and tell an untruth. He has not worked for the IMI company for over 5 months. He is here as an ordinary working man. He has a job, and he comes in here and tells us what he believes to be the truth. If you do not believe the witness, then you should acquit the defendant immediately. On the other hand, if you do believe Phoenix, then you must compare the credibility of his testimony with that of the defendant, Mr. Bunting. I do not see how you can decide this case unless you determine which witness is telling the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, that is sometimes a very difficult thing to do. If, on the other hand, you think Mr. Phoenix came in here and lied to you in any respect, you then accept part of his testimony. You can reject part of his testimony, or you can accept it all. If, however, you think that the defendant told the truth in part, well, then you may give his testimony whatever weight you think it deserves. Credibility simply means that you believe what you were told. It is as simple as that. It is just as the word implies, credible, believable, not unbelievable. Both witnesses cannot be right since their testimony was so different. Since that seems obvious to me, I must assume that it is obvious to you. However, you will have to determine which witness you believe. You must not make a decision on testimony that you do not believe credible. In other words, if you decide this happened or that happened, you must base it on the evidence that you heard from the witness stand and that you believe is truthful and credible. Another point is that we have had considerable argument in this case, considerable objections, but you have listened carefully to the final arguments of counsel. This is your duty and, of course, your obligation. However, remember that the arguments of counsel are not evidence. You must determine this case simply on the evidence from that witness stand and the exhibits that will be in the jury room when you retire to begin your deliberations. Of course, members of the jury, I am sure you know it, but I always have to mention it, and that is the verdict you reach must be unanimous. Until the verdict is unanimous, it is not a verdict. Mr. Foreman and members of the jury, we have a case here with some important aspects to it, which I shall advert to at the apposite time. It is not much, as some of the counsel have pointed out, the accident in itself, or the way it happened. Although, of course, I'm going to refer to that because that is the predicate of recovery if the plaintiff has any recovery, but certain other minutiae as to the extent of the injuries. Do not forget that I am coming to that, and keep your minds focused on that when the time comes. First, as to the way this accident happened. It was due to a collision between a car belonging to and operated by one defendant and a tractor trailer belonging to and operated by the other defendant. That collision took place, there is no doubt about it. And you have here among the exhibits marked on a map a cross to show the point in which the collision between the two vehicles is said to have taken place, and check mark to show where the car was at a central time described by that same witness. I shall not go into a description of the accident, except to say that the averment of the defendant railway company is that the tractor trailer in some way struck against the side of the car. That appears to be the theory. In other words, this defendant contends that it must have been the fault of the trucking company in that, as testified to by the driver of the truck, the car ran into the truck. I think that is a sufficient statement of the two theories. The defendant railway company counsel points to the indisputable evidence as to where the glass was broken in the car as evidence that that must be where they came in contact. And if that is where they came in contact, and for the first time, of course, it means that the car could not have run into a truck head-on as claimed by the other defendant. Now, plaintiff was the passenger in the car. The defendant owed him a duty, but it was not the duty of an insurer. Unless you find that the accident was caused by the negligence of the railway company, you cannot hold that defendant liable. You cannot hold the other defendant liable unless you find that the negligence of the driver of the tractor trailer contributed to cause the accident. You may find neither liable, you may find both liable, or you may find one liable. Your verdict, if you find for the plaintiff, must carefully show against which you intend your verdict to be, remembering that the burden is on the plaintiff to show you, by a fairly greater weight of the evidence, you believe every fact upon which he relies, including the cardinal fact of the negligence of either defendant and each of the defendants in this case. He cannot recover against any defendant that he has not shown to be negligent by that burden of proof, by a fairly greater weight of the evidence you believe. Now, assuming and only assuming that you have passed by that point of liability,